Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell, and I am doing yet another webinar on the issue of cosmology, culture, and the arts. I'm calling this part two. I've already done the first part, as many of you know, posted it earlier this week. This is part two, and I'm calling this the Gnostic Strategies and Tactics of Cultural Marxism, which we'll be getting to fairly late in this webinar. This webinar is long in terms of the amount of slides it has, but I need to lay a certain groundwork, conceptual groundwork, so that those Gnostic strategies and tactics of cultural Marxism will be more appropriately understood. And again, this is with the usual caveat that I hope that what I will present in this webinar is of benefit to you. Now, this webinar is divided into four sections. The first is going to be a brief review of the sources or the books that I'm going to be using, some of them more than others, in this presentation. The second component of this webinar is going to be an exposition, albeit a very, very brief one, of the Frankfurt School Marxist critic Theodor Adorno. He was a member of the so-called Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and we're going to be discussing in particular, once again, the music, or anti-music as I prefer to call it, of Arnold Schoenberg, a bit briefly about Stravinsky, by way of reference to the German novelist Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. It's very interesting that Thomas Mann was familiar, he was an acquaintance of Arnold Schoenberg. He chose Schoenberg and fictionalized him as the character Adrian Leverkühn in his novelization of Dr. Faustus, which is a presentation of the Faust legend in terms of music. The Schoenbergian music becomes a metaphor in a much larger sense for the demise of Western culture, particularly in Nazi Germany under National Socialism. Then thirdly, we're going to talk about the strategies and tactics of dialectical Gnosticism, both in its ancient forms, which most people are familiar with, at least in a very sort of cursory way. And then finally, I'm going to be reminding you of something very significant and interesting that Bernstein, in his lectures at Harvard University, the Norton Poetry Lectures of 1973, and then later in his book called The Unanswered Question, dealt with. We're going to be, as we're going to see, we are missing three key elements, and I'm going to present what he says there. Hopefully, within this wider context, you'll be able to appreciate the significance of his remarks. I tend to think that Bernstein was enough of a historian and a musicologist that he would have been very, very aware of some of these ideas which I'm presenting. He may not have been, obviously, in entire agreement with them, but I do think that he would have at least understood the context from which I'm making them. So let's begin. Let's look at the sources. The first one, obviously, is this book, The Antonio Gramsci Reader. This is edited by David Fortegas, and this is selected writings of the Italian communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who more or less, if we were to think of one individual in particular that invents the idea of cultural Marxism, it would be Antonio Gramsci. This book was published, as you can see, at the University of New York Press in the year 2000. The ISBN number is up there on the screen. The second book that we are going to be referring to is this rather thick book. This is actually 500 plus pages containing essays of the German music critic Theodor Adorno. And you'll recall, for those of you who have listened to the Bernstein lectures all the way through, Bernstein himself does mention Theodor Adorno rather frequently, particularly towards the 5th and 6th lectures in that series. And this is a book entitled Essays on Music, selected with introduction, commentary, and notes by Richard Leppert. This was a publication in 2002 of the University of California Press in Berkeley. Thirdly, this is an important little book. It is written by an American political and cultural conservative by the name of Michael Walsh. titled The Devil's Pleasure Palace, and the subtitle is The Cult of Critical Theory and the Subversion of the West. It's a very, very high overview of the way that Marxism, progressivism has infiltrated cultural criticism. It's also a very good book. It's probably, from that point of view, it's probably the best one-volume summary. And as I mentioned before, the Theodor Adorno book is 500 plus pages. So he really kind of boils it down in a simple and arguably, in some cases, perhaps a simplistic manner, but nevertheless a good book. As you can tell, the subtitle here, The Cult of Critical Theory and the Subversion of the West. This is an Encounter Books publication from the year 2015. So this is a fairly recent book. Now, fourthly, one very, very important book, as I've already mentioned, is the German novelist Thomas Mann, and the title of the novel, Dr. Faustus, The Life of the German Composer Adrian Leverkühn, as told by a friend, translated from the German by John Woods. And this is a vintage book, paperback, 1999, and you see the ISBN number up there. I'm going to be quoting rather extensively from this because you have one artist, in this case a novelist involved in literature, writing about another artist and about his influence, and in particular using the Faust myth to extricate and to extrapolate the spiritual influences and the philosophical consequences at work in Arnold Schoenberg's music. Now, for those of you who don't know Arnold Schoenberg, you can go on YouTube, Google some of his music, and attempt, I would say, to listen to it as much as you can, or can stand, I would say. One thing you might want to listen for is the piano pieces. That will give you a quick idea. And after you listen to those, you can also listen to Nora the Cat, and I referred to that in part 1. So to understand what's going on in the novel, it is perhaps a good thing just to acquaint yourself very briefly with Schoenberg's so-called music, or again, as I like to call it, anti-music, and for reasons that we're going to get more in depth with in this webinar. Finally, of course, I'm going to be making reference to one of my favorite musicologists and music critics, and himself a musician and composer of some notoriety, Leonard Bernstein. Most of you may be familiar with his music from West Side Story, or perhaps even from Candide. He did write a number of Broadway plays. He also did his own symphonies and a number of other more serious works. So again, not only just a critic, but a composer, and one very, very much within the broad high tradition of Western music, and also, since he did Broadway musicals within the popular tradition of Western music. You see the title up there, The Unanswered Question, 6 Talks at Harvard. These are literally transcripts of the lectures, the 6 lectures he did at Harvard University in 1973 for the Norton Poetry Lectures. So now let's move on to the second part of this webinar, dealing with Theodor Adorno, the Frankfurt School, Arnold Schoenberg, to a very, very limited extent, Igor Stravinsky, and then Thomas Mann's novel Dr. Faustus, using Schoenbergian music as a metaphor for National Socialism, cultural decay, anti-traditionalism, and so on. Now, before we get started, I'm going to be presenting excerpts from the dialogue between the fictionalized version of Arnold Schoenberg, the German composer Adrian Leverkühn, and the devil. Now that occurs in chapter 25. It's rather like the 11th chapter of Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray in the sense that it's a very rich, very Baroque text to read, but it is in the form of a dialogue between Leverkühn and the devil. Now, I need to make, again, a couple of general observations here. Thomas Mann was an acquaintance with Arnold Schoenberg, and his telling of the Faust myth within a musical context, a musical philosophical context, is really a metaphor within a metaphor. He's using the music itself to represent the Faustian bargain, and then that in turn is being used to represent what happened in Nazi Germany and the wider issues of cultural suicide. The second thing to note is that when the dialogue occurs, Adrian Leverkühn has already found out that he has contracted a venereal disease, which will ultimately lead to dementia. And this means that hovering over the dialogue itself, you never really know if this is really taking place or if this is a hallucination. But in any case, as Thomas Mann is cleverly pointing out, it doesn't really matter whether it is a hallucination or really taking place or some combination of the two between those two extremes on the spectrum, because the end result is the same. So let's begin with some excerpts here from the novel. And we'll begin with the devil's first question. And of course, being the devil, he presents it in the form of the moral and aesthetic equivalence of good and evil, and beauty and ugliness. Have you forgotten, he asks Leverkühn, what you learned at your academy, that God can bring good out of evil, and that the occasion thereto ought not to be curbed? And that's kind of toward the beginning of that dialogue. It occurs on page 251 in that vintage paperback edition that I showed you. And a little further on, he now begins the assault on tradition and reason. And here you have to pay very careful attention, because Thomas Mann is really going right to the philosophical heart that is at the center of the issue of the musical crisis that Bernstein talks about, that crisis being what happens when you deliberately reject all artistic tradition in its entirety. And here's what the devil says. We offer better still. We offer foremostly the right and true, a thing no longer even classic, dear boy, which we let be experienced, a thing archaic, primal, a thing that has long since ceased to be attempted. Who knows still today, who knew even in classic times, what inspiration, what genuine ancient primal enthusiasm is? Enthusiasm ne'er sicklied o'er with criticism, lame prudence, and note these words now, and the deadly reins of reason, what holy rapture is. And notice the references here constantly to classic times and to reason. In other words, he's combining and telling you that tradition and reason are inextricably combined. You cannot have one without the other. Now, in order to make sure that Leverkühn understands what he is offering, the devil clarifies his offer with specific reference to music. One may think of this as the devil's first offer to reject a tradition in order to achieve absolute originality. And he says this, quote, take, for instance, your fresh idea, or what you call such, what you have all called such for 100 or 200 years now. In other words, note that the time that the devil's referring, since Adrian Leverkühn is active in the 1920s and 30s in the novel, that would put it back in the 1720s and 1730s. In other words, right at the height of the Baroque era in the arts. So again, take, for instance, your fresh idea, or what you call such, what you have all called such for 100 or 200 years now. Now, note at this point, again, that he's referring to a tradition or craft of musical composition. And he continues, for that category did not exist in olden times, as little as musical copyright and all that. The fresh idea, then, a matter of 3-4 bars, no more, is it not? All the rest is elaboration, the grindstone, is it not? Good. We, however, are sapient and know the literature and remark that the idea is not fresh at all, that it recalls too much something that occurs in Rimsky-Korsakov or Brahms. What to do? One simply changes it. But a changed idea, is that still a fresh idea at all? And just a short little while later, the devil adds significantly, quote, God leaves to reason all too much to do, but it is possible solely with the devil, the true Lord of enthusiasm, unquote. Now note that this is taking direct issue, a direct attack on what I said in part one, that you have the notion within that tradition, within that time, that the universe is good, but it requires the perfecting role of man and reason, all right? So in other words, the whole thing, if you're going to assault tradition, you have to assault the whole complex of ideas and concepts that are behind that tradition. And that occurs again on page 253 in Dr. Faustus. Then we come to the devil's second assault on tradition, and this occurs in the form of the assault on tonality and structure versus, quote, sincerity, unquote. The devil says, composition has itself grown too difficult, desperately difficult, where work and sincerity no longer agree. How is one to work? But so it is, my friend, the masterpiece, the structure in equilibrium belongs to traditional art. Emancipated art disavows it. Now, let me pause and note here the clever dissembling. Only a rejection of tradition is equivalent to emancipation and sincerity. There's no argument, there's simply assertion here. And you'll find this concept lurks right at the heart of much of the musical and artistic criticism of the so-called Frankfurt School. Now, continuing with the devil. The matter has its beginnings in your having no right of command whatsoever over all formal combinations of tones. In other words, what he's saying here is you must reject the ordered relationships of the harmonic series. Idem est, reject tradition absolutely. To drive this home, the devil continues. Quote, the diminished seventh, an impossibility. Certain chromatic passing tones, an impossibility. Every better composer bears within him a canon of what is forbidden, of what forbids itself, which by now embraces the very means of tonality and all traditional music. Now note, this is a backhanded admission by the devil. Acceptance of tradition means that reason orders relationships of notes and harmonies, and therefore that certain procedures are forbidden, or rather, won't work because they make no rational sense. Therefore, in order to enable those procedures, one must abandon tradition and, therefore, reason altogether. And again, this is in the 25th chapter of Dr. Faustus, pages 254 to 255 in that vintage book text. Then we get the devil's third assault on tradition. And this can be summarized by saying only completely anti-traditional music will achieve timelessness and immortality. And this is a very clever usage of Thomas Mann of the creation story and Adam and Eve in the garden with the devil tempting them to immortality and the knowledge of the gods. The devil says, quote, an implacable imperative of destiny, disallowing all superfluity, negating the phrase, shattering all ornament, stands averse to temporal expansion, the very life form of the work, unquote. So in other words, what he's suggesting is if you wanted to achieve true immortality, Adrian Leverkühn, you have to abandon every last shred and scrap of tradition. And we're going to see ultimately what this really means. This is followed very quickly by the devil's invitation to a complete solipsism and narcissism. And note, he's asking first for the rejection of all tradition. In other words, utter nihilism. And nihilism is going to be replaced by an absolute subjectivity and, if you will, narcissism, or a kind of extreme self-centeredness. The devil says, quote, certain things are no longer possible. Now, please note, again, this is not an argued position. He's simply stating it. He's simply asserting it. Certain things are no longer possible. And that, again, I want to stress that you will find this type of statement occurring over and over again in the works of the Frankfurt School, and in particular in the work of Theodor Adorno, the music critic. The devil goes on. The illusion of emotions as a compositional work of art, music's self-indulgent illusion, has itself become impossible and cannot be maintained, the which has long since consisted of inserting pre-existing formulaic and dispirited elements as if they were the inviolable necessity of this single occurrence. Now note, what the devil's doing here is taking direct aim, once again, at that Baroque doctrine of effect. And remember, the time frame in which the devil's referring to the tradition of music is exactly rooted in that Baroque era. So he's taking direct aim at the doctrine of affect, of certain procedures designed to invoke certain universal human emotional responses. Think of film music in this respect. You can think of Danny Elfman or James Horner or Bernard Haitink or for that matter, John Williams in the Star Wars movie music. In other words, film composers know these formula and know them well and know how to use them to manipulate an emotional response through the music that's accompanying the movie. Now, the devil goes on to state this. Criticism of ornament, of convention, of abstract generality, they are all one and the same. What falls prey to criticism is the outward show, now note the words here, my friends, of the bourgeois work of art, an illusion in which music takes part. He goes on. The subordination of expression to an all-reconciling generality, if the inner is the innermost principle of musical illusion, and that is over. Again, assertion. The claim to presume the general as harmonically contained within the particular is a self-contradiction. It is all up with conventions once considered prerequisite and compulsory, the guarantors of the game's freedom, unquote. In other words, the only way to complete freedom of self-expression in the arts is complete abandonment of all traditional craft of the compositional art. So then we come to the devil's final invitations to Adrian Leverkühn. What he's offering him is a complete break with tradition in order to achieve artistic immortality. Again, it's the temptation to godhood, to dare a barbarism, and then ultimately, as we're going to see, the final break with life itself. Again, here's the devil. I did so merely to intimate that you should break through it, that you should raise yourself above it to the most dizzying heights of self-admiration and make such things that a holy horror of them should come over you, to the life and manner of a god. Do you understand? It is not merely that you will break through the laming difficulties of the age, you will break through the age itself, the cultural epoch, which is to say the epoch of this culture and its cult, and dare a barbarism, a double barbarism, because it comes after humanitarianism, after every conceivable root canal work and bourgeois refinement. Believe me, barbarism has a better understanding even of theology than does a culture that has fallen off from the cult. And that's on pages 258 and 259. And now we have the final price of the renunciation of tradition. And I want you to listen very, very carefully here as to what the ultimate implications of that rejection and renunciation are. The devil again says, in recompense of which we will meanwhile be subject and obedient to you in all things, and hell shall profit you, if you but renounce all who live, all the heavenly host and all men, for that must be, unquote. And again, that's Dr. Faustus on page 264 in that 25th chapter. Now note that this rejection of all life has certain consequences in terms of the four purposes of music that I surveyed in part one. That tradition of music had four extra musical purposes or foundations or motivations, as it were. Firstly, it expressed a transcendent natural and divine order, the harmonic series. Secondly, it expressed the correspondent ecstasy of humans in contemplating the idea of transcendent beauty and sublimity. And thirdly, the profound mystery of transcendent natural order and of man's place as a co-creator within it. And then finally, the fourth motivation or foundation, as we saw, taking J.S. Bach's comments as our cue, was the refreshment of the soul, including the idea of entertainment, relaxation, tapping the toe, tossing a few back, mellowing out, and so on. Now, put in those terms, notice that the devil's invitation to Leverkühn in Dr. Faustus to reject tradition and dare a barbarism is really a demand to reject all four purposes of music, and I would also aver of all the other arts. This barbarism is to be a music against music. It's to be an anti-music. And that in turn recalls the statements of Antonio Gramsci that I noted in part one. Let's recall them. Quote, "The proletarian revolution cannot but be a total revolution. This revolution presupposes," now listen to this in terms of Schoenberg again, "the formation of a new set of standards, a new psychology, new ways of feeling, thinking, and living that must be specific to the working class." And lest we forget, for Gramsci, this means again the rejection of bourgeois tradition. Quote, "These values too, unlike in the bourgeois period, will be created by the working class on the basis of organization." In other words, no tradition, but simply a bureaucratic set of abstract rules without any relationship to it. And that's from pages 70 and 71 in the Gramsci Reader. Which brings us to Theodor Adorno. It's worth noting that one of the leading luminaries of this so-called Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, a euphemism really for a Marxist-inspired musical criticism, was Theodor Adorno, pictured at the left, and to whom Leonard Bernstein refers quite often in his celebrated Harvard Norton poetry lectures, The Unanswered Question. It's also worth noting that Thomas Mann actually alludes to Adorno in one of his descriptions of the devil during the exchange between Leverkühn and Mephistopheles that constitutes the famous 25th chapter of Dr. Faustus. Listen carefully. Quote, "A little and a little during his last speech, something else had happened to the fellow before my eyes." Now, this is Adrian Leverkühn writing his description here. "When I looked at him direct, he seemed different to me from before. Sits there no longer the pimp master and bawd, but rather, begging your pardon, a better gentleman, has a white collar and bow tie, spectacles rimmed in horn atop his hooked nose, behind which somewhat reddened eyes shine moist and dark, the face a mingling of sharpness and softness, the chin soft with a dimple in it, and yet another dimple in the cheek above." And you actually do see in the original version of the picture those dimples, a slight dimple on the chin and in the cheeks on Theodor Adorno. Leverkühn continues his description. "Pale and vaulted the brow, from which the hair indeed retreats upward, whereas that to the sides stands thick, black, and woolly, an intellectualist who writes of art, of music, for vulgar newspapers, a theorist and critic who is himself a composer insofar as thinking allows." Now, if we sum all this up, we note that you find the same elements implied in Gramsci in a generalized conceptual form as one finds in the anti-music of Schoenberg in their specific application to music. First of all, you find the rejection of bourgeois tradition precisely by number two, a technique of the creation of values, which is brought about by pure organization. That is to say, in Schoenberg's case, a set of arbitrary and completely artificial rules of ways of creating new ways of feeling and thinking, as in the artificial compositional rules of Schoenberg, which again are designed as deliberate means of defying the natural and transcendental order of the harmonic series and all the traditions stemming from it. So thirdly, note that in rejecting tradition, and remember this was actually the word used by the devil in Thomas Mann's novel. Note that in rejecting tradition as bourgeois, one has the typical Marxist code for, quote, the equality of results, unquote, and the idea of the leveling of all hierarchies of value and artistic purpose. There can be no high culture nor popular culture. One is entertained, not merely bemused by it, as with Nora the cat. Does one experience the divine, the beautiful, the good, and the transcendent in this music? Can one read a Marvel comic book and call it literature in the same breath as Percy Shelley or Oscar Wilde? Well, Gramsci would have us say yes, because they're merely stylistic differences, nothing more. This notion of our four putative hierarchies of artistic and musical purpose is crucial, for in the leveling universe, that distinction is eradicated. It would be similar to insisting that one must listen to the music of the high culture all the time, to J.S. Bach, but never to ABBA or Charlie Parker or the Beatles or Duke Ellington or Glenn Miller, or the converse, and to see or perceive no distinction of purpose in either. Note that this implies a very ancient conception of what hierarchy really is. It deals with purpose or function as a definition of a position. In the Gramscian Adorno universe, not even God is allowed any Sabbath rest and must endure the constant adoration of his creatures all the time, nor are they ever permitted to rest from their labors of praise to go play. In the Gramscian Adorno cultural universe, one has to reject Pace Mann's Dr. Faustus, all bourgeois tradition. In that universe, only the music of Schoenberg represents the pure egalitarianism of absolute subjectivity, of the egalitarianism of the notes. The four purposes of music are eschewed. Hierarchy, and hence tonality's innate mathematical relationships and the equally innate human living response to them, is eschewed for something completely artificial. If there is any doubt about this, consider the following quotation from Adorno's On the Contemporary Relationship of Philosophy and Music. Adorno states, quote, of necessity, one's thoughts are drawn to Arnold Schoenberg, the master of the new music. If indeed the title of master, which derives from the realm of craft and has been shamefully abused by Wagnerian ideology, may still be employed today. One must speak of him not only in order to right at least a small part of the wrong that ignorance and conformism continued to do to Schoenberg, even in the very last moments of his life of integrity. However impotently, let us here affirm what even the general consensus will one day be unable to deny, unless the notion of the morbidity of great music should come true with catastrophic speed. Schoenberg, and again the right words are lacking because they have all been appropriated by the culture industry of celebrities and are worn out, was the true musical force of our era and above everything else, a great composer, unquote. And that's from page 148 in that collection of essays. Now, it's important to note that by culture industry, what Adorno is actually referring to is jazz and rock music, which are, again, let us note, popular applications of the bourgeois rules of tonality and the craft of composition. So in other words, Adorno wants to be rid of all of it. J.S. Bach, the Beatles, out they have to go. Where Adorno is correct, and where he is incorrect, is that the leveling of hierarchies and purpose and function to absolute artificial anti-natural rules of subjectivity. This he does get correct, and he's extolling it as an artistic virtue, which of course I don't think many of us would be terribly comfortable with. Now, Michael Walsh, in his book that I showed you at the beginning of this webinar, examines the whole Gramscian Frankfurt school of cultural Marxism by comparing it to the central humanistic Christian myth at the center of Western civilization in his excellent little overview, The Devil's Pleasure Palace, by noting the totality of the agenda. Quote, "The work of the Frankfurt scholars, among them Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and Wilhelm Reich, was grounded in an ideology that demanded, as Marx would say, for philosophical reasons, an unremitting assault on Western values and institutions, including Christianity, the family, conventional sexual morality, nationalistic patriotism, and adherence in general to any institution or set of beliefs that blocked the path of revolution," unquote. And you'll find that on page 42. But how did all that come to infect the West? Listen carefully. Quote, "Who were these people? Marxists all, first and foremost, sent fleeing from their think tank roots at the Institute für Sozialforschung, the Institute for Social Research, at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Where else? The Third Reich hounded them out, in part because they were Jews, and in part because they were communists. Adorno and Horkheimer liked to imagine their works as a kind of message in a bottle to the future. Unfortunately for posterity, several of those bottles washed up on the eastern bank of the Hudson River near Columbia University in New York City, changing the course of American history," unquote. And that's in Walsh's book on page 43. Now, wait a minute. Isn't that the same Columbia University that became the bastion of progressivist education philosophy, with people like Edward Thorndike and George Counts espousing essentially a similar quasi-Marxist view of education, which similarly owed its ultimate roots to Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, as we outlined in Rotten to the Common Core? Yep, that's the one. Now, continuing with Walsh, this is what he says about the origin of the tolerance tactic. Quote, "Marcuse came up with the particularly nasty concept of repressive tolerance, a notion that has guided the unholy left since the publication of his essay by the same name in 1965 in A Critique of Pure Tolerance by Marcuse, Robert Paul Wolff, and Barrington Moore, Jr. It might best be described as tolerance for me, but not for thee. But let Marcuse explain." And now Walsh is citing Marcuse directly. "The realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance toward prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and the extension of tolerance to policies, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. This means that the ways should not be blocked on which a subversive majority could develop. And if they are blocked by an organized repression and indoctrination, their reopening may require apparently undemocratic means. They would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, or which oppose the extension of public services, social security, medical care, etc. Liberating tolerance then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left." Now, you'll notice here that it's the right that's violent and the left that isn't. However, if you've been watching history and any form of socialism when it takes power, it usually ends up being pretty intolerant and pretty violent. Now, Having cited this from Marsu's, Walsh continues. Saul Alinsky precisely articulated this as rule number 4 in his famous Rules for Radicals. Quote, make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. You can kill them with this, for they can no more obey their own rules than the Christian church can live up to Christianity, unquote. But now note what Walsh says. By casting human frailty as hypocrisy, Alinsky and his fellow community organizers executed a nifty jujitsu against the larger culture, causing it to hesitate when it should have been forcibly defending itself, unquote. And just to drive the point home, Walsh notes the same thing we've already commented upon. Quote, against the evidence of their senses, they insisted on the egalitarian principle, embodied for Adorno and Schoenberg's method of composing with the 12 tones, a system that required all 12 notes of the chromatic scale to be sounded individually in a sequence called a tone row before any one of them could be repeated, thus affording all notes equal importance. For critical theorists, dodecaphonism, also known as the 12-tone system, was the perfect metaphor for the egalitarian world they sought to create, unquote. And that's on page 59. Or if I may put this principle even a bit more forcefully, all men are equal before dehumanizing, unnatural, and artificial ugliness. So consider the chain of unreasoning rationalization thus far. Number 1, genuine and sincere and authentic artistic or musical expression is no longer possible following traditional crafts of composition, since this is rooted in a transcendent universal physical law of hierarchy of tonal relationships. Thus, number 2, to achieve absolute originality, one has to reject tradition in toto. Note the clever but unargued idea that to be original means to reject tradition. And recall the devil's comments here in Thomas Mann about the fresh idea. But number 3, in order for any reason to be evident in such rejection, completely new artificial rules have to be imposed, created by organization, to use Gramsci's phrase, in order to counteract that traditional craft and the innate human responses to it at every turn. And therefore, number 4, violence must be done to the entire cultural system in order to create a complete rejection of tradition with its notions of hierarchies of purpose, to the end that an egalitarianism of results, both in the notes themselves and in the human response to it, issues from it. All men, again, are reduced to equality of responses to ugliness. If one senses in these propositions something very ancient, something indeed very Gnostic, one would be correct, for they bring us chin to chin with the actual strategies and tactics, the techniques of all artificially dialectical, that is to say, all Gnostic systems. And this, of course, brings us to the third point in our webinar, the strategies and tactics of dialectical Gnosticism. Now, I want to begin by dispensing with some general misapprehensions. Most people are vaguely familiar with Gnosticism. Unfortunately, they operate or think of it under a variety of misperceptions of it. Thus, before we can deal with the techniques or the stratagems and tactics of dialectical Gnosticism, we must dispense very briefly with the misapprehensions of it, brought about in no large measure by a plethora of popular scholarship emanating from the New Age movement. In these brief remarks, I'm basing my comments on the exposition of Gnosticism undertaken in the first volume of my final theological work, God, History, and Dialectic, the Theological Foundations of the Two Europes and Their Cultural Consequences. Gnosticism is popularly conceived by many people to be the oldest original form of Christianity, and the subsequent Catholic Orthodoxy to be the creation of the Emperor Constantine and the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which supposedly suppressed the Gnostic Gospels and other, quote, lost books of the Bible, unquote. The basic problem here is, firstly, that Constantine's views did not actually prevail at Nicaea, and secondly, that most biblical scholars, even those inclined to view Gnosticism favorably, realize that the Gospels of the New Testament predate the so-called Gnostic Gospels. A second problem is a more narrowly confined one, and that is that when Gnosticism is studied in most graduate schools of theology, it is studied as a series of conceptual or doctrinal systems, rather than as a study of techniques of institutional subversion to move an institution away from its cultural conceptual moorings and replace them with something else. It is this approach to Gnosticism that I took when I was a professor, and it is still my view today, and hence the approach I take here. With this in mind, we may now look briefly at those techniques and at the actual strategies and tactics of Gnosticism. In doing so, the parallels between them and cultural Marxism become quite evident. So let's look at Gnostic tactic number one and its ancient application, and then its modern variant, its modern manifestation. That first tactic is what I call contrive orthodox contexts. Now, in ancient times, that manifested itself precisely by the creation of Gnostic Gospels that were different in their conceptual content and following different metaphysical rules than one finds in the Gospels found in the New Testament. So in other words, it's not simply a claim of one ancient document versus another. There's actual conceptual differences between one set and the other. Now, if you look at that tactic being applied today, again, what you would be doing is contriving traditional contexts. And how would that manifest itself? Well, again, if we look at the anti-music of Schoenberg, he composes operas, suites, piano pieces, fugues, and so on. So in other words, he's using the traditional titles and even to a certain extent the traditional form, but injecting them with an entirely artificial content done and made by completely different rules of composition. Or we could even contrive an even broader context. We could call this product, this production, we could call it music in the same breath as we call the Beatles or Simon and Garfunkel or J.S. Bach or Handel or whoever music. The second Gnostic tactic is a very important one. And in fact, it's so important that you see this almost at all points in today's political discourse. The second tactic is to attach new meanings to old terms, and those new meanings are known only to those in the, quote, Gnostic community itself. So in ancient times, words like salvation, heaven, rebirth, resurrection continued to be used by the Gnostics, but they were completely redefined in a very different way than that which you find evident in the New Testament itself. For example, salvation came to mean for the Gnostics salvation from matter, from the worldly, fleshly existence, and not a salvation manifest within it. And thus that whole idea directly opposed certain doctrines of Christian orthodoxy from the incarnation to the sacramental system itself. But in its modern manifestation, what do we have? Well, as we've seen with Marceau's, words like tolerance, discussion, dialogue, and even democracy come to have entirely different meanings from those understood by the vast majority of society, and therefore mutual comprehension and dialogue actually break down. Now, what's the goal of that previous tactic? Well, this brings us to the third tactic, quote, create two organisms or conceptual groups within one institution, each operating with entirely different minds. Now, in the ancient church, this issued with two different understandings of illumination. On the one hand, for the Orthodox, this meant illumination by and within the sacramental tradition. For the Gnostic, it meant having a kind of encounter with the discarnate non-material world and liberation from the world of matter and flesh. And indeed, one could only truly be illuminated in that condition. But how would this manifest itself in the real world? How would we create two organisms or conceptual groups within one institution, or rather within a culture, each operating with entirely different minds? Well, here again, Michael Walsh's comments are very illuminating. He says, quote, "The current struggle between right and left, like the conflict between Occidental civilization and Oriental Islam, is in part a battle over terms. The two sides do not speak a common language, nor do they take the same words to mean the same thing. Similarly, the modern left's ideas about justice have nothing to do with justice as most Americans traditionally understand it, blind, impartial, and procedural, and everything to do with payback, social, economic, and results-oriented. Both Muslims and leftists, in the furtherance of their aims, rely on their common enemy's good-natured misunderstanding," unquote. And that's from page 177. And that brings us to Gnostic tactic number 4. And this is the really important one, because I would venture to say that most of us probably can list examples of this tactic in action because we see it all the time. That tactic is create new terms or words, and from them, new realities. And again, think of Gramsci's new ways of feeling and thinking here. Now, using Walsh's insight that words like justice or tolerance mean one thing to a traditionally minded person, and quite another to a Gnostic or cultural Marxist like Gramsci, new words must be invented lest someone feel offended or left out by traditional words. And again, thus we have the principle of egalitarianism and leveling. To take just two examples, we're all familiar, firstly, with the introduction over the past, say, 30 to 40 years of non-gender specific pronouns, which, if you think carefully about that, leaves out everyone, okay? And secondly, think of the change of the word mankind to the word humankind. But why do this at all? Well, for Gnostic systems, ancient or modern, the adaptation of the new term signifies what is crucial for the Gnostic, or for that matter, for the cultural Marxist community, depending on the period one examines. The adoption of the new term signifies the, quote, raised consciousness, unquote, and the adherence to the agenda itself and the capitulation to its demands. Thus, these seemingly slight changes in language are crucial to the program, whether or not one is looking at actual words or the new musical words, the tone rows of an Arnold Schoenberg. So to boil this tactic down to what it really is saying, use of the method is assent to the agenda. Well, how do you combat all this? Well, first of all, awareness. Most of us are aware, particularly when it comes to these tinkerings with the English language or whatever language you happen to speak in the name of some sort of abstract egalitarian principle of tolerance or not being offended or what have you. We're all aware of this. So I think we can safely move on to point number 2, and that is, well, if you're aware of it, don't play along with it. In other words, cultivate traditional habits of diction and usage. Just don't go along with it, in other words, and be aware of it when you see it being practiced. But let's get back to music. Now, obviously, one thing emerges from this, and it was best stated by Leonard Bernstein in his 1973 Harvard Norton Poetry Lecture Series, The Unanswered Question. For Bernstein, the succession of music from the high tradition of the late Renaissance and Baroque eras ran not through Arnold Schoenberg, nor even really through Igor Stravinsky with his own unique brand of anti-music, but through the tonal tradition, and that meant through modern popular music. He writes this, Quote, I am a fanatic music lover. I can't live one day without hearing music, playing it, studying it, or thinking about it. And all this is quite apart from my professional role as a musician. I am a fan, a committed member of the musical public. And in this role of simple music lover, I confess freely, though unhappily, that at this moment, as of this writing, God forgive me, I have far more pleasure in following the musical adventures of Simon and Garfunkel than I have in what most of what is being written now by the whole community of avant-garde composers. Right now, on the 21st of June, 1966, that is how I feel. Pop music seems to be the only area where there is to be found unabashed vitality, the fun of invention, the feeling of fresh air. Everything else suddenly seems old-fashioned. Electronic music, serialism, and that's another way of designating Schoenberg's so-called method of composition. Chance music, they've already acquired the musty odor of academicism, unquote, and that's on pages 420 and 421. Now, while Bernstein subsequently goes on to modify these remarks, his point remains the same. For music to be music, it must be tonally grounded. His point, however, should not be missed. While classical music was following the Pied Piper of Adorno and Schoenberg off the cliff into anti-art, the tonal tradition was being maintained by, of all things, something not classical at all, but by popular music, a kind of musical populism. But note, this means that at least in the musical tradition, that tradition was hanging and remains hanging by a thin thread. For what motivates that music is primarily and almost exclusively the fourth of our musical motivations, idem est, the refreshment of the soul and entertainment. And in that, it expresses a kind of leveling of its own. I believe passionately that to reverse this decline, we must not only be aware and to refuse the blandishments of linguistic tinkering and the other Gnostic tactics, but much more importantly, that cultural survival requires the arts to be completely and thoroughly relearning the respective traditional crafts of creativity in art, architecture, literature, poetry, painting, and music. And for those of us not in the arts, to support those attempting to do so. Now, with that, folks, I hope you've gained some benefit from those remarks. Again, I'm doing a very, very high overview of Thomas Mann, Theodor Adorno, Arnold Schoenberg, Leonard Bernstein, and so on. But I hope that once you have understood the way that those Gnostic tactics have been applied culturally, that you'll be able to recognize them, because, like it or not, we're in an era where politics and culture are now intermingled to such an extent that it becomes impossible to understand each other. And that, again, has been by deliberate design, with the deliberate redefinition of certain terms that mean one thing to one group of people and another thing to another group of people. This is deliberate. It is not accidental. So anyway, I hope that's been beneficial to you. If it has, please let me know. And I will see you on the flip side. Bye-bye, and God bless everybody.